Okay, thank you very much, Caroline. And I really feel great honor and a great pleasure to be invited to this Bienali, Istanbul Bienali. Congratulations for the success of this Bienali. Last 2 days I visited part of that. I know that much more exhibitions there, but most of, I think that I already see that, how successful it is. Thank you very much. I really enjoy the whole trip. So actually when I received the letter of invitation, I was excited by this event, together with the especially focus on the last paragraph of that letter. You say that the exhibition or some events will happen in the splendid palace that the Bui Kada. So that's why I immediately pick up the topic of the new pool issue, partly because of immediately about the Trotsky and the history of the past, not for the future. But on the other hand, I know that especially in Europe, not only in Europe, a lot of people also through this path to rethink reflection on the communist moments in 20th century. Within that, especially the Trotsky became the resources of inspiration for the democracy within that the socialist movements. So that's how his critique of the Stalinism and critique of that the autocracy it's within that the moment. So that also reminded me of something that I think about in the spirit, not necessarily repeat or the resort to that old tradition. But I think we can learn something from that. And before I talk, you can stop me how many minutes?
25, 30.
25, okay. You can interrupt me, stop me in any moment. That I want to say something because because here I'm in Istanbul eventually, and this is not the first time for me, but every time I really enjoy that. I don't know whether or not in Turkey that the China and the Chinese Revolution in 20th century was sought as a reference for the reform or the revolution or anything else that what happened here, I don't know. But since the end of 19th century, down to the first, especially the first half of 20th century, Turkey is the topic for the Chinese reform and the revolution. Is a topic for the huge debates from later Qing down to especially the World War I and the collapse of the Ottoman Empire and so on and so forth, that period. And the rule of the Ottoman Empire and the rule of the Young Turks and that huge debates in China. So the debates on Turkish issue for Chinese looks like an issue for Chinese reform and the Chinese Revolution. And partly because in the late 19th century, early 20th century, both the China and the Turkey, or the Ottoman, was faced a similar situation. The first is both are multi-ethnic empires. And under the pressure of the Western powers, you have to reform yourself. And what's the choice? Conservation of your tradition or the religion, or the conservation of your, at that time, in terms of the race, or the conservation of your state. So all these issues became the crucial topic. So the revolutionaries developed their interpretation of what changed in Turkey. And the reformers were sought as the reformers, which means that they're against the radical revolution, also developed the interpretation of the path of the Ottoman and the Turkish. So that's so interesting, which reminded when I was yesterday when I was Buikata, immediately it reminded me of all these kind of the stories in China. So looks quite distant, but actually you enjoyed some. Actually, we have some overlaps and similarities. At some, actually, the real connections in the historical view. So in that sense, I think the discussion about the Turkish issue or the discussion on the Chinese issues, to some extent, there were certain kind of the interactions here. This is the first. story reminded me. Second is interesting. When I was in a splendid palace, I immediately reminded me of the space that where a Trotsky Chinese revolutionary came to Turkey in 1929 in order to meet Trotsky in the Buikaki, whose name is Liu Renjing, who actually was the early member of the Communist Party in the early 1920s. So later we know that after the mid of 1920s, the split and the within the communist movements, both in Soviet Union and also the impact in Chinese Communist Party. At the same time, in 1929, it was the year, the first world financial crisis, the whole economic crisis, the whole world started. Second, it was in the period when the Chinese Revolution was set back. It's a huge setback because in 1927, the communists, there was a massacre happening in Nanjing, Wuhan, Guangzhou, and so on and so forth. At that time, Trotsky developed the idea that he saw that what the Chinese revolutionaries made the two mistakes. One mistake is that the radicals shouldn't join the KMT, that nationalist party. You should keep yourself, your political value, radical value, rather than join the KMT, that was a nationalist party for the Nordic war, Northern Expenditure War. So this is the first. So whether or not you have a united France with your next enemy, actually, at that time they tried to unite it. Trotsky thought this is wrong. Second, Trotsky actually thought that at the beginning he was not optimistic and actually quite critical to the idea of the revolution in the East, because basically you have the class foundation. You are almost no mature working class. It's a peasant society. How can you develop the proletarian revolution in such a backward society? So he sympathetic, but he had critical views on that. So that's why that also caused the internal tensions that within the Chinese revolutionaries at that time. So the Liu Renjing came here for his instruction for Chinese Revolution. He actually met in 1929. He met the Trotsky there, and Trotsky asked him to come to the island every day. So he stayed there together for more than 20 days. So eventually, we know that the story here yesterday that he wrote the pamphlets of the Russian Revolution, the book on the Russian Revolution. Few people know that he actually, it was there through the interviews, he published pamphlets with the help of the Liu Renjing on the Chinese Revolution and the strategy of the oppositional school within the Communist Party. I mentioned this story, it looks like a history, but actually when we talk about the future, we also need to think about this kind of the history, because the whole issue is that both of you mentioned that nowadays we talk about the crisis of democracy. When we talk about the crisis of democracy, actually we talk about the very specific type of democracy, which we labeled as a Western democracy, liberal democracy, and so on and so forth. But what in crisis is not only the liberal democracy, but the political systems emerged from 19th, 20th centuries. That the political systems is not only the Western type of democracy. In the 1989, we already know that the whole collapse of the socialist system. So which means that both systems, during the whole 20th century, they confronted each other, but now, when and after, they're in a crisis. So in that sense, to some extent, it's a universal crisis rather than single crisis, because which means that the old political systems now face the big challenge. So that's why it's not only you cannot blame other systems to justify your own systems. This strategy was a Cold War strategy, completely I think that delegitimized because of the nature of the crisis. And but what I can today, so that in the aftermath of the Cold War, a democratic political system didn't undergo any, because on the other hand, any significant formal changes. We saw that the election still continued. We saw that the political parties were very active in the campaign. And yet democracy at the social level is in crisis everywhere. So when we talk about the crisis of democracy, we need to do some distinction or the analysis. In China, where the socialist system is preserved, so-called socialist system, state structure, and the form of government has not undergone fundamental change. But its society has been so powerfully transformed that there was a constant discussion about just what kind of the society it is. The people say it is the official claim is a socialism with a Chinese characteristic. Some people argue that it was a capitalism with a Chinese characteristic, and you can label it in different ways for these. And the crisis in political legitimation results from the breakdown of the representation within the political system. That is the separation of the political and the social. So the crucial issue is you still have the function and the working, in the political system in working, that democracy as a only system here. Still you need the party politics, the parliamentary politics, election, and so on and so forth. But what's the real crisis is the separation between the political form and the social form. The political justice of the socialist state, in Chinese case, was general justice centered on the concept of class. Before, if we talk about even the citation, yesterday I watched the video where the Trotsky repeated the talk about that, the faith, loyalty, and so on and so forth, still based on that concept of the class. Containing the leading status of the working class, the alliance between the workers and the peasants, general representation of a nation state, and the internationalism that spoke to the oppressed classes and the nations. Within this framework, the issue of dignity of the working class becomes the issue of class liberation and of general liberation of humanity, that the old. It was the working class party that promoted and created the labor movement and the peasant movement, the worker and the peasant alliance, the United Front and International Class Alliance. Hence, the political transformation characterized by the statification of party marked not only the transformation of economic forms, but a process of depoliticization that signified the failure of a working class state and the dissolution of a political justice that centered on class. So in the new class formation, the leading status of the working class defined by the Constitution has become an irony. In the crisis of the agriculture, rural area, and the peasant, and in urban-rural polarization, the worker and the peasant alliance has dissolved into pure fiction. And in the case of the regional polarization, economic and social polarization is manifested as a racial conflicts, ethnic conflicts here and there, and together with the religious conflicts too. In international the relations, market logic has replaced the early so-called internationalist solidarity. No matter people like it or dislike it during the Cold War time, that the whole issues. So these are the connotations of the so-called rupture in the representativeness or the disjuncture between the political form and the social form. So why have both of these 20th century socio-economic systems fallen into crisis? What factors account for the changes in the social character of democracy? And is it not possible to overcome the crisis by resorting to other systems in this context? Because in the Cold War time, every time in both sides, you criticize other, and all after the 1989 in China, any critique of Chinese reality, you need to resort to the Western models. But now, because of this the universality of that crisis, then these pattern of thinking is facing the big challenge. So we need to rethink about it. New concept, new thinking. It's necessary. So the global capitalism, the change of the rule of nation state, the limits of the supranational institution, and the limits and of the citizenship, well, are all the crucial issues for thinking of the democracy in the future, or different, maybe alternative political forms in the future. So now why I would like to talk something about the two new pools. And I try to give a very brief discussion because of the limits of the time. And is basically I try to argue that the new pools and what's the politics for the new pools in nowadays. What's the difference from these new pools politics, possible politics, different from the class politics in the 20th century. I think this is what happened to these. So basically, I think that we need to think about the question that is a democratic, post-democratic politics possible? I mean, by nature should be everybody participation, which means that the democratic. But on the other hand, it's not this type of democracy. So what I call it, a certain kind of the post-party politics is possible too. So the issue is, given the transformation of party politics into the state party politics, are we entering an era of post-party political democracy? Because basically I argue that there was a transition along the great transformation of the global transformation and the market transformation, that the traditional political parties, either like in China, political party, Communist Party, or the different political parties, gradually integrated into the framework of the state, not as a political organization. Because if you argue that when those political organizations or political parties raise their political values, it's only for the campaign. In the administration, in the daily the administration and the so-called governance, is nothing about the difference of political values. So on the one hand, in the campaign, you see the very furious confrontations, but eventually the socio-economic policy are very much similar, not only the left wing, right wing, but the religious and the secular. They all focus on the market economy, globalization, and so on and so forth. So these kind of what we call the so-called centralization of the political parties, or the so-called, in my term, is a kind of statification of political parties, which means that the political party no more as a political organization, but an organ of the state only. It's a function as an organ of the state. So how is the public sphere to be reconstructed? And how can one set up a new political systems on a legitimate foundation? That is another aspect of the crisis. The crisis of political party, the crisis of the public sphere. On the one hand, the public sphere was manipulated by political power or the religious power or the capitalists directly. So they colonized the political field. So the media, so colonization of media over the political sphere is the general phenomenon. So in that sense, the public sphere, if the public sphere is the precondition for substantial democracy, what kind of the public sphere we need to reconstruct it, reshift is another the question. And then what forces are in a position to create the ideal foundation and the moral culture for the new politics of equality? What kind of the forces that we talk about compare the 20th century and now? Because the 20th century, for the radical moments, they resort to the class politics. If you look at no matter the Lenin's, Trotsky, and Mao, and all those people, they resort to the class politics. So, but now, who are the subject for inventing these new values? So who are not only the ideas, but also their role in the society were there. If the crisis of democracy can be understood as a breakdown of the representation, and if the state continues to dominate the political sphere for a long time, is a democratic post-democratic politics possible? And if so, how can it be achieved? That became the big questions, I think. Now I move to this is a kind of the general introduction for my questions. The second part of my question is about the new pools and their roles. Basically, I try to divide it or make the distinction between two types of the new pools. The one is the new workers. Basically, you know that in the Western countries, especially in Western Europe or America, there was a long process of deindustrialization and the shrinking of the scale of working class in those countries. So this is the phenomena. However, in China, the last decades, we perceived the long process of the formation of large-scale working class is a water factory, and also the workers, large-scale workers. So following these the formation of the large-scale working class, China's Gini coefficient in 1980s was only 0.2, and now by the 2010, it had reached 0.438. Now some people say that they're even much higher than this. So it's a most unequal society China already has become. On the one hand, you have the rapid growth and the shaping of the new working class. So the largest portion of the new pool is made up of the so-called migrant workers. It's about 240 million people in China. That's the migrant workers. So-called migrant workers means that they came from the countryside, migrated to the urban area, the rural area. The decline of the socialist, at the same time, there was a decline of the socialist era working class. The old working class disappeared from these state-owned factories, collective factories, so-called working units, and so on and so forth. And replace them was much larger in the scale, the working class. Today, the vast majority of laboring people in China are not industrial workers in the traditional sense, nor the farmers in the traditional sense, but the half worker, half farmers, and the people with rural residence permits who are both workers and farmers. This is very special in China because all those the laborers in the urban area, their registration household system based on the countryside. So legally speaking, they own a small part of the land. So it's not a proletarian, it's a kind of the laborers with certain kind of the land property. So this is the very special. And so that's why now the Chinese labor relations, the people argue that mainly it's a labor service relation rather than a labor relations, because like infrastructure construction, in the construction industry, more than 80% of the laborers without the labor contract at all is a kind of temporal workers. So they were suffered from these status. These were what we call the new, one of the largest new pool. A second one is a separate group, different from both the traditional working class and the new workers. Is far more active within the realm of politics and the culture. Unlike the rural migrant workers, they are victims of the consumer society. And lacking in internal demand, they have often received high education, working in various fields and living on the outskirts of the large cities. Their income, though similar to that of the blue-collar workers, is insufficient to meet the consumptive demands stimulated by consumer culture. So new poor as a consumers without the ability to consume, that according to the definition of Zygmunt Bauman, worker consumerism, and the new poor in the book he talked about, they are products of the capitalist economy's move from manufacturing toward the finance capital, from the real economy to the virtual economy. And these new workers and the new poor together constitute the two sides of the contemporary China's concept of the poor people, basically. So it's interesting that to discuss the new poor only from the standpoint of the consumption risks overlooking the political capacity of this group. It is not difficult to see their likeness in the protest moments of the Egypt, Tunisia, Occupy Wall Street movements in the United States, in Hong Kong, in Taiwan, the various other Occupy movements that drew inspiration from it, such as many. It's like, as I said, most of the subjects were those young people, so-called new people. In contrast to these new people born of the process of deindustrialization in Europe and the United States, China's new poor sprouted from the transition from a socialist to a post-socialist system. However, until today, the mobilizing ability and the political demands of these groups have had little to do with the newly ascendant working class or the fate of the rural migrant workers. These are stratum which lacks a long-term social goals. So we can see that on the one hand, people say now we are almost at the end of the era of depoliticization. We are at the we are actually at the beginning of the repoliticization, maybe. However, even some moments became successful in achieving their short-term goals, but most of them fail to provide the long-term goals and provide the independent political value, which radically different from the consumer culture in the nowadays. So this is the big issue. So in that sense, if you look at compare these the period to the 20th century, that what happened in 20th century China was that very active the class politics without the major class foundation, which means that the politics was certain kind of detached from its class foundation, but became very active to create certain kind of the universal values, no matter we like it or dislike it. However, nowadays, we are in the reality, we had a large-scale class strata, but without the class politics at all. You have the certain different kind of occupation moments, but not that based on that. But it also reminds us of the possibilities that why I mentioned the early 20th. I think that even Trotsky was wrong, that he thought that the class politics should be based on that kind of the foundation. Because so that's why he was a little bit pessimistic for the Chinese Revolution at that time. So in the forms, especially during the 1930s to 1940s, in the long process of the so-called People's War, that the mass line and the United France and the National War, the construction of the certain kind of political forms emerged together. So the so-called concept of People's War was, for me, was not only about the military struggle. It's a kind of the political category which can reintegrate everything together to transform the political subject into a new form. So not only the peasants were transformed during that process, even the Communist Party during the wartime fundamentally transformed from its early stages. So certain kind of the elements of democracy you can find there. The failure of that democracy, people's democracy, after the establishment of PRC is another story. So you can see that a certain kind of political organization, the governments, the form of governance, and the social movements in the process of transforming the people and the political organization together is so-called the form of politicization in the 20th century. So they were able to create a certain kind of the new political subjectivity. We can learn from that kind of the long process rather than it's the later forms, because we, as a historian, sometimes we need to do some periodization. That very short period was very active. That explained the early success of that moment. And also, it can explain why the reason of the failure of the later, the socialist state in the state form. Because basically that the Trotsky was right, that the bureaucracy and so on and so forth. So in that sense, it's not, we talk about the decline of representation or the representative democracy and so on and so forth. Then the issue is that for us, for the political thinking, is that simply to reconstruction of the representativeness. The people, political parties will argue for that, or we need a long political process to transform this or to creating the new subjectivity or the new universality. That was the idea for the future democracy or any potential political forms for everybody, for the people. So thank you very much. I know that I have no time to do that.
Thank you so much. Thank you. So if I understood correctly, because I'm not sure I did, but just to make sure that I understood a little bit, you're saying that there's no point in actually making a sort of imagining a solution immediately to what is the political form of the future, because what we should focus on is how to nurture a transformation where there is an alliance between the new migrant poor, which are everywhere in the world, as we know, not just China, I mean, it's from Abu Dhabi to everywhere, the new migrant poor and the cognitive, creative poor.
Yes.
Okay, so, and once this operation of marriage or becoming with occurs, then the new political form will emerge.
Yes.
That's what you're saying?
Yeah.
Good.
Yeah, one sentence.
One sentence.
Is that because, which reminds us in a Bienali, the artists, scholars, intellectuals, the role of them were actually, in that sense, for that the possibility of politicization. So the artists or the intellectual thinking with double faces of that. One is autonomy. Is because we argue for the autonomy of arts or intellectual work. Is for the creating of the new values and the politics.
Okay.
And then you find a certain kind of organic process.
Well, that's really interesting. I mean, one really usually reads either about problems of migrant workers without passports in some place, working long shifts, or one reads about the precarious laborers of cognitive capitalism. One rarely reads about the relations between these two. So very good, thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Good. Okay, so